There are massive protests in Georgia right now. I don't know if you guys have been looking at the footage, but it's pretty wild. Here's some live footage of the protests that are going on in Georgia. I'll give you guys a basic rundown of what's happening in Georgia. So the Dream Party, which is like the ruling party, is trying to pass legislation that would label NGOs and organizations that take 20% of their funding from overseas as foreign agents. And in the way how it translates in the Georgian language, which I don't speak, but I've been told by people who speak Georgian, it's like obviously a very negative connotation. And this also comes with certain monitoring by, I think it was like the Ministry of Information or the Ministry of Affairs, some ministry. It comes with monitoring from a ministry as well. And if you do not, go along with this, you can get very substantial fines for your organization. A lot of people have been comparing this proposed law to a law that was passed in Russia in 2012 that was then expanded to be able to go after journalists, NGOs, and any organization that basically at all questioned the Kremlin's rule or was like, hey, maybe you shouldn't do these human rights abuses. And so people are scared that what we're seeing right now is the start of a long descent from Georgian democracy into authoritarianism. And so a lot of people have gotten onto the streets to protest. Now, the Georgian government has assured the people that this is not the case. This is about transparency. This is about letting the people know that these people are getting, it's a slippery slope. That's what they're saying, that this is about transparency. Now, certain NGOs related with transparency are saying that's not the case, but they're saying that it's about transparency, and that's the main issue, that it's not an issue about going after any of these NGOs, and that this is completely in line with EU, with the principles of the European Union. Why are they talking about the European Union in this context? Well, if Georgia was to do a long descent into authoritarianism and start doing more and more restrictions on the press and NGOs and organizations that work with human rights in Georgia, that could lead to them falling so far out of the standards of what it would be necessary for them to join the EU that they wouldn't be able to join it. And the vast majority of Georgians want to join the EU. I was looking at some of the data. I think like the lowest number I could find was like 75%. Right? The vast majority of Georgians want to join the European Union. They want access to visa-free travel. They want access to the single market. They want access to, they probably are very supportive of the protections for human rights and civil society. They want to join the European Union. And in these protests, and I think I even posted a picture of it. Let's see if I can find my picture. You've seen a lot of EU flags, a lot of EU representation. If you talk to the protesters at these events, here's right here. This is a Squidward meme. This is probably not the one I should show you. That's not very serious. Sorry. It's a good meme though. I love Squidward. And a lot of these protests, you are seeing people waving these flags. For example, look at this clip. This clip has gone super viral as these protesters are getting hosed down by the government. I don't know if you guys have ever been actually sprayed with like a riot control hose before, like these hoses that are used for like riot. It's not specific hoses, but like hoses used during riot control. They don't feel good. It's like somebody hitting you with like almost like a bat. It like hits you hard. It can like peel off your skin. It leaves whole, like really terrible spots. I mean, that's what American cops used to use against, civil rights protesters during the civil rights movement, and it would mess them up. I know it's just water, but the amount of pressure that's being fired up really mess people up. Anyway, This is the type of reaction that they have gotten from the police. They've also been a lot of tear gas. There's been a lot of violence towards protesters. But let me be clear, it's not only violence towards protesters. The protesters have gotten, and I'm just going to be blunt with you guys, pretty violent as well. Now, the majority of them, okay, mostly peaceful. The mostly peaceful protest meme. Oh my God, he said it. But no, unironically, mostly peaceful. But there have also been at least 3 documented instances of petrol bombs being used against the police force. And according to the cops, over 56 cops have been injured. A lot of stones have been thrown as well. Here's just one example of a petrol bombing. I don't know if there's any sound of this. There isn't, but boom, there it is right there. There's a cop, boom, petrol bomb. So the Georgian protesters are not playing around, to say the least, okay? They are not playing games. They are not playing games. The protest numbers I've heard for the amount of people that have been mobilized seem to be in the tens of thousands right now. So we're not talking like 1,000 protesters here, 1,000 protesters here. We're talking tens of thousands of people in the Georgian capital trying to push back the cops and protesting outside of the parliament building. So that's the most basic rundown of this. Now, there's also been an international reaction to this, where Amnesty International, the American ambassador, and what is probably one of the most, I think, what's going to be very difficult for the Dream Party to work their mind around, or work their media around, considering the majority of Georgians support European Union membership. The EU's foreign policy chief, or foreign policy representative, a foreign affairs representative, they came out and said that this legislation that the Dream Party is trying to push through, against the wishes of the semi-independent party type president who while in DC recently condemned it. The president of Georgia condemned it and said they will veto it. The Dream Party has enough votes that they can override that veto, but just showing that this is certainly not like something that's supported by the majority of supported by the president of Georgia. The EU is saying that this does not fall within the values of the European Union, that this is bad and this is wrong. And if Georgians want to join the EU and they are hearing from the EU's representative that this law does not fall within the EU's values, then the message that are being sent to these protesters, which is why they're reacting so angrily, is if this law is passed, we could basically kiss European Union membership goodbye. This is going to be the start of a long descent into a Russia-style authoritarian system in Georgia, which they don't want, especially considering that Russian-style authoritarianism led to an invasion of Georgia in the late 2000s, like 2008. So this is an extremely divisive issue in Georgia right now. It's gotten a lot of people very, very, very angry, and they think that the future of the country is on the line, the future of the country joining the single market, joining the European Union on the line, and that's why people are out on the streets right now. Obviously, not everybody is going to agree with my characterization of the event, but I mean, you can go listen to other people on this as well. I saw some people getting really angry at me for my posts about this, explaining exactly what I explained. But I'm sorry I didn't use RT. I'm very sorry I didn't use that source. Anyway, where were we? Oh, yes. Back to the Georgian protests. So they're still going. They're still live. There they are right now. It's pretty intense on the streets. This is the second day of protests, and they don't have any time of stopping in the near. They don't have any sign of stopping in the near future. But the Dream Party has also said that they're not relenting. Now, they have also sent for an opinion from the Council of Europe, and I wonder if the Council of Europe reacts and says they don't like this law is bad, if that will have any impact or any sway. But as it stands right now, the Dream Party has a veto-proof majority, and as long as they don't have anybody break the line, or we have some type of Euromaidan situation where they're like, oh, dang, this is getting out of control, they have a clear path to get this legislation through, even with the president, while in the United States, committing to vetoing this legislation. I could get into a lot more of the niche details about the Russian oligarchs' involvement with the Dream Party and stuff like that, but that's not really important. So I want to move on to the TLDR video about this, because I think they probably are going to do a good job. I haven't seen it. I just saw that they released it for the first time, but they do really good videos when it comes to explaining stuff like this. So let's watch this.
This video was brought to you by...
One last thing, though. I do need to mention this. in early, I think it was not early 2022. I think it was mid 2022, maybe June, July, something like that. I think it was Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia were basically like asking like, hey, we would like to become EU member states. And Ukraine and Moldova were kind of like moved up to the next tier, like to applicant status. Like, hey, okay, you know, we'll take your application, you know, we'll listen to you. We're gonna consider this. Georgia was not given that same status. They were not moved up that same tier on that path to joining the European Union. And so this is also added to this sense of urgency that like we're already starting to see this drift in this direction affect Georgian society, and we're moving in the opposite direction Georgia would need to move in order to join the European Union. Not to mention the territorial disputes with Russia when they're backing the South Ossetian rebels and the invasion that they did, that also stopping them from joining something like NATO, but which also there seems to be some hunger for that in Georgia as well. I don't know the exact polling on NATO membership, so I'm not going to claim to know it. If anybody in chat does, I would appreciate the mention. But yeah, anyway, to TLDR, let's listen to what they have to say. Love their videos. They did a really good interview with Mitch McConnell. I'd recommend it if you guys want to go watch it on your own.
NordVPN. Since Georgia achieved independence in 1991, its foreign policy has steadily oriented towards the West. And this does make sense for historical and cultural reasons. As a Christian country, many Georgians feel more European than their neighbors do. And polling suggests that something like 75% of Georgians actually want to join the EU.
This is like the low number, right? I saw some polls saying it was like 80 to 85. Like the low number is 75%. Like there's a lot of love for the EU in Georgia, man. It's loud. I'll try to turn it down.
In fact, under their previous leader, Georgia pushed for stronger relations with the West and helped to create the EU's Eastern Partnership Program. This was so successful, in fact, that Georgia eventually obtained a visa-free regime for the Schengen area in 2017 and applied for full EU membership in June of last year. However, in the past year or so, the country has shifted dramatically away from the EU and towards Russia. EU-Georgia relations have deteriorated to such an extent now that last year the EU Council declined Georgia's candidacy for EU membership. And in June 2022, the EU set out a list of 12 demands for Georgia in order to be granted candidate status, including the de-oligarchization of Georgian politics, transparent judicial reform, and a guarantee of free, pluralistic, and independent media.
Okay, so the first two things, of course, are important, but it's that last point that this legislation has to do with that a lot of people are saying that this is going to regress their path forward, that the EU gave them a path forward. They said, this is what you need to do to join the European Union. And they're doing the exact opposite of what the European Union asked them to do and what the majority of their people want them to do, since the majority of the people want to join the European Union.
So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at why Georgia has drifted away from the EU, why the government is getting so cozy with the Kremlin, and how this might change in the future. So the main reason for this shift is down to the former Georgian Dream Party leader and former Georgian Prime Minister, Bidzina Ivanishvili. Ivanishvili is a powerful oligarch who made his money in Russia in the 1990s and is conspicuously close to the Kremlin. In fact, another former Russian oligarch described...
Hey, I said I didn't want to get into it because I didn't want to get into these details, but hey, TLDR's got me covered. Appreciate it, boo.
Him in 2012 as a man who plays according to the rules set by the Russian government. Ivanishvili is also Georgia's richest citizen and owns a cartoonishly villainous castle with a priceless art collection and massive shark pool perched on a mountain overlooking the capital. Now, Ivanishvili served briefly as Prime Minister from October 2012 to November 2013, and has in effect ruled over Georgia ever since, although he holds no formal government post. That's because despite this, Ivanishvili controls the ruling party, Georgian Dream, key state institutions, and the economic area. In fact, most key members of the government and party officials today have some sort of history with him. For example, the current prime minister was his hand-picked successor. The current head of the State Security Service used to be his former business associate, and the first deputy interior minister was his personal bodyguard. So it's clear to see that one of the key reasons that...
So this is when one of the richest men in some of the richest people in Russia and some of the richest people in Belarus are people who just used to be the friends of Vladimir Putin. And it's because since they were so close to this person who has immense power, they can kind of just like gift all this money and influence a government contract to their friends because they have the ability to do that. If they want to make their friends happy, they can. That's something you see a lot in nations that have an oligarch problem.
That Georgia-EU relations have deteriorated is Ivanishvili's authoritarian tilt. For example, in October 2021, when the former Georgian president returned from exile, he was violently transferred to prison hospital, allegedly threatened, and then denied adequate healthcare. And even the European Parliament have got involved with this, with them asking for him to be released because he still chairs the National Reform Council in Ukraine, with the Parliament requesting that he receives medical treatment outside of Georgia. It seems, though, that this incarceration and mistreatment are mainly due to political revenge, according to Amnesty International, and as a favour to Vladimir Putin, who conducted a short war against Georgia in 2008 and once promised to hang the former president by his balls. It's not just that, though. Ivanishvili has also started to curtail the freedom of the press. In May 2022, the country's former justice minister was sentenced to 3.5 years in jail for abuse of power, with these charges against him supposedly relating to decisions he made in his previous role as the head of the television company Rustavi 2. But it's probably got more to do with the fact that he now runs the main Georgian opposition TV station. Ivanishvili's government has also taken a particularly harsh stance against LGBTQ+.
So this also is something that happens where a lot of the people who are really high up in power, even the ones that oppose each other, are all corrupt or oligarchs or they have like different problems with them. And so once you're corrupt and you get a position of power, what you do is say, look, I'm against corruption, and you prosecute your enemies. This happens a lot in authoritarian countries or countries sliding in this direction. So it's basically like and it's not even authoritarian countries. This happens a lot of times in even Western democracies, but it happens more often in authoritarian countries because you're using the systems of power mainly to go after your opponents. Not because you have a genuine concern about corruption, but more that it's an easy way to go after those who oppose you.
People. When half a dozen self-described ultra-Orthodox and traditionalist groups held a counter-rally against a pride march held in July 2021 before attacking 53 journalists before storming the headquarters of a local LGBTQ+ organization and another civil society organization, and then replacing the EU flag in front of the parliament with an Orthodox cross, Georgia's prime minister refused to condemn them, declaring that this is the opinion of our population, and we, the government elected by the people, shall obey that.
Fuck 'em.
The only parade I know is that of our army. So that...
Okay, you can't, if you will not condemn people going out and attacking and abusing and trying to intimidate minority groups who are practicing their freedom of expression, if you won't condemn that, then you don't care about freedom of expression. You don't care about free speech. I don't care if you didn't like them. Like, you don't give a fuck.
That's the main reason for Georgia's shift. The ruling party, under the influence of Ivanishvili, have become increasingly authoritarian, apparently even mimicking aspects of the Kremlin. The second reason, though, is the war in Ukraine. Despite taking roughly 100,000 Russian exiles, mostly young, educated males fleeing from Putin's military mobilization, Georgia has refused to join the Western economic sanctions against Russia and has still not returned an anti-aircraft missile system that Ukraine gave them back in 2008. The current Prime Minister of Georgia has also refused to condemn the Russian invasion and instead said that Ukraine was being punished. The government is once again at odds with its own population here, though, with thousands of Georgians taking to the street to show their support for Ukraine.
This is the thing. Georgians support Ukraine. Every Georgian I've ever met is extremely supportive of Ukraine. In fact, one of the most well-known military groups in Ukraine is the Georgian Legion. which actually I think at one point I almost got an opportunity to interview them. I didn't end up pursuing it because I had to leave the country. But they have like over like up to around right here, it says over up to 1,000. I don't know the exact number. That's from March. It's been a while since March. But it's pretty well known. It has a lot of press coverage. It gets attention very easily. It's a little edgy. They're very edgy boys, and they've been accused of some gross stuff. But point is, Georgians support Ukraine overwhelmingly. It's not even close. And so the fact that the government is out of step with its people when it comes to EU membership, it's out of step with its people when it comes to the modern Russian state, it's out of step with its people when it comes to Ukraine. It just keeps getting out of step with its people. It's out of step with its people when it comes to anti-corruption efforts, and it's out of step with its people when it comes to freedom of expression. It just seems to keep getting out of step with its people.
And polling suggesting that the vast majority of Georgians support Ukraine, with some 1,000
Took the words right out of my mouth, didn't he?
Georgian volunteers even believed to be
I swear to God, I did not pre-watch it, okay? I did not pre-watch it. He stole that from me. He stole that from me. He went forward in time, listened to what I was going to say, and he stole it.
Fighting alongside Ukraine. In response, the Georgian government has threatened to revoke their Georgian citizenship on the ground that they're fighting for the interests of a foreign nation.
Boo, sucks. Get fucked. I mean, that stuff pisses me off. Because people are going going to another country and risking their life fighting for freedom, fighting against the same enemy, which, again, not too long ago, invaded Georgia and killed Georgian people in a bombing campaign, displacing tons of Georgians permanently from their homes. And they're going to remove their citizenship for fighting against that same government, literally the same exact government, Putin's government, that did that in Ukraine. It makes no sense.
Now, the Georgian government argue that this strategy is necessary in order to protect its country from Russian imperialism, at a time when no other world power would be willing or able to come to their defense. And to be fair, Georgia does have cause to be wary. In 2008... I understand the motivation there, but let's be for real. Russia's not going to choose whether they invade or not invade Ukraine, Georgia, based upon whether individual Georgians went to Ukraine to fight. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I highly doubt that Russia right now is like, damn, you know what we need? Another war. Just saying. Like maybe in 5 years, something like that. But right now, yeah, okay, I highly doubt it. War broke out between Georgia and Russia, with this resulting in Russia taking control of the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which roughly accounts to about 20% of Georgia's overall territory. And Russia still maintains a military presence in both territories. Nonetheless, whatever its strategic merits, the policy isn't popular with the Georgian public, and it's fair to say that Georgian Dream's relatively Russia-friendly stance on Ukraine is at least influenced by their ties to the Kremlin. So, to conclude, while the Georgian public might feel European, the country's politics remain constructed and dictated by its geographical proximity to Russia and its pro-Russian political elite.
So, aside from the pro-Russian political elite, another country where I could think of the geopolitical interests of the nation state seceding any possible commitment.
Burns is an
immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Synagus HS, thank you for the tier 1 beats up for 4 months. I subscribed and all I got was this lousy message. Wow. Well, you also got my attention for 10 seconds. Anyway, back to this. The other nation state I'm thinking of is Israel. Israel has done basically nothing to support Ukraine. There's done like a little things here and there, but nothing substantial that we could really point to and be like, wow, that was a big help. Something that the United States has requested of them is that missile defense systems that we gave Israel like in the 60s that they don't even use anymore. We're asking them to send that to Ukraine because then maybe it can be put into use. The odds of that missile defense system being used in Israel in the near future is very low, but it could obviously be used to great effect in Ukraine, even if it's somewhat out of date, because they need missile defense. They need missile defense and air defense a lot right now, not only to protect its skies and protect its people, but also if it wants to conduct counteroffensive, it's going to need that as well. Israel responded by saying, no, Just no. And the main motivator behind them saying no to all of these requests isn't some just general hatred for Ukrainians or something. It's because if they piss off the Russians, then the Russians might block Israeli access to Syrian airspace, which the Israeli government has used, and they actually used it, I think, a few days ago again, to bomb Iranian-backed militias and militias that they think could possibly be a threat to Israel in some way, right? Whether that threat is real or just perceived, I don't want to get into a deeper conversation, but that's the strategic interest that is at play here from Israel that's stopping them from supporting Ukraine. But in Georgia's case, I just don't think it adds up, considering, again, Russia has invaded Georgia. They attacked Georgia, and they're currently occupied with another war. It just doesn't make sense they would block people from going over there to fight. When what's Russia going to do? Invade Georgia and fight Ukraine at the same time? Some people talked about that a few months ago, about the possibility of a two-front war and how that could be used against Russia. I don't think that's going to happen. I think people are just like kind of writing fairy tales and fan fiction about it. But I don't think the Russians are going to sign up to a two-front war. And I think the Georgians need to think in the long game, which is the European Union, NATO, some alliance structure. It doesn't even necessarily need to be NATO. They need something to stop the Russians from invading again. They invaded once, and outside of their preoccupation with the invasion of Ukraine right now, what is to stop them from invading again in the future? Now, they could choose to instead be subservient to Russian interests, but that also means ignoring the will and wants of their people to have more press freedom, to have visa-free travel with the European Union, to have economic trade and prosperity with the European Union, and to move towards a more strong civil societies and a strong free society. That's what the majority of Georgians want, but the current Georgian government might not just be in line with the interests of the Georgians, because they're thinking about, not pissing off the Russians. And this is the core of the conflict. Anyway, let's continue.
Neither of which is great news for those on the European side of things in Georgia, or for the war in Ukraine more generally. A couple of years ago, I was a victim of identity theft, and I only found out when a letter from the...
Okay, so that was ad. Okay, thank you for ending it that way. Anyway, if you guys want to know my take, I support the Georgian protesters. I think that if they want to join the European Union, they should be allowed to. I think that reforms to get rid of the corruption in their country and the oligarchy are good, and it's good for the European Union to encourage it. And I think it's good for the European Union to encourage freedom of the press and freedom for these NGOs to operate in the country, advocating on behalf of civil society, advocating on behalf of freedom of expression, and a strong judicial system, and just a generally strong society moving towards the EU. If they want to join the EU, that should be their choice, and I don't think anybody should stop them. So, I want to give an update on yesterday's story on the protests that were going on in Georgia. So, to fill people in very briefly, there are massive protests going on right now in Georgia because the government, led by the Dream Party in Georgia, introduced a bill that would label any organization like an NGO that takes, or press organization that takes money from foreign sources that makes up 20% of their budget or more as foreign agents, which gives a pretty big negative connotation, as well as putting them under, I think, surveillance by the Ministry of Information. Now, this was condemned by like Amnesty International, basically every NGO you can think of. It was condemned by the United States Ambassador, Jake Sullivan. It was condemned by Jake Sullivan. It was condemned by the EU ambassador, or the EU foreign representative. It was condemned by basically everybody and their mama. From an outside source. And protesters went onto the street because they were scared that it was going to endanger their pathway to EU membership. Now, the Dream Party was asserting that don't worry about this. This is not a big issue. This is just like the laws the United States passed in the 1930s, which was the same justification that Russia used in 2012 when they introduced similar legislation that was then used to go after the independent press and NGOs that were doing good work in Russia. And so many people weren't buying it. They went on the streets, they protested. It got violent with the police using hoses to hose protesters down, beating them up, throwing tear gas. The protesters were throwing petrol bombs at the cops, throwing stones. Of course, the majority were peaceful, but there were people doing that, and I've seen the footage. It's pretty insane. There was over 77 people detained. There were, I think, according to police, like 56 cops were injured. And it was a big scandal internationally for Georgia. And the president of Georgia actually said while in the United States that they would veto said legislation if it went through. Did that really matter? Not much. It maybe rallied the crowds a little more, but it didn't matter because the Dream Party had enough votes in order to override the veto. This whole thing got so heated that in Parliament, in the Georgian Parliament, when the debate for this was going on, a literal fist fight started. And there's footage of this. I don't know if anybody would link it in chat, but there's literal fist fights in the Georgian Parliament over this. Anyway, after all the international backlash, after the EU representative comes forward and says, hey, you know, this is actually probably gonna we don't like this. This is bad beans. And if you want to be part of the EU, this is not the way to go, which the vast majority of Georgians, I think the lowest polling data I saw was like 75%. The vast majority of Georgians want to join the EU. After the protests and the backlash and everything, the Dream Party has officially withdrawn the Foreign Agents Bill. Now, this does not mean that the protests are stopping. In fact, the protest leaders have specifically said they're going to continue to protest until all of the protesters that have been arrested have been released, until the bill is formally withdrawn and condemned, which would make it more difficult for the Dream Party to, in the middle of the night, while nobody's paying attention, reintroduce the bill, which has happened in other scenarios similar to this. A good example I could actually use would be Euromaidan, when Yanukovych, in the middle of the night, rejected a agreement with the European Union that would have allowed visa-free travel and a bunch of economic arrangements. He did it in the middle of the night, hoping nobody would notice, and that started the Euromaidan protest movement. So protesters are scared that they still might go back on it, so they want them to condemn it, not just withdraw it, but they need to finish withdrawing it, go through that process, and condemn it, so we know that they're not going to do it again. Even if they condemned it, they could still do it again, but it would make it more politically difficult if they condemn it and then went back on their word. And so that's the position we find ourselves in right now. Now, be clear, the fight isn't over. The protesters are still, they still need to be released. It still needs to be condemned. That's still a goal that they're pushing for. They want to make sure that they don't reintroduce this in the middle of the night. Protests are still set to continue. But this is a massive victory for the Georgian protesters. They have made the government step back, reevaluate, and start taking a few steps back in the face of all of this international and domestic backlash. And I can do nothing but give the Georgian protesters credit, because I looked at some of the footage. I looked at the photographs of them getting hosed down, them getting beaten, of the tear gas getting fired, of people getting treated for tear gas. Those protests did not look pretty. Those people were standing up and they were flying the EU flag, getting hosed down. The tweet that I posted today to promote today's stream, let's see if I can bring it up, was actually one of the pictures that really connected with me of these protesters getting hosed down while flying the EU flag, because they were terrified that this was going to be the first step in a bunch of steps towards making it basically impossible for the Georgians to join the EU. In fact, while Ukraine was able to be added to candidate status, as well as Moldova, I believe, earlier in 2022, Georgia was not. And one of the reasons was due to press freedoms. And so this is the exact opposite direction they needed to go. Big victory for the Georgians.